Good day. Today is Thursday, 30th January 2025. We are coming towards the end of the first month of 2025, and we are now more than a week away from Donald Trump's inauguration. And in the meantime, all the great conflicts that we are familiar with, and which have been the topics of these programs, the conflict in Ukraine, the conflict in the Middle East, the standoff between the United States and Iran, and Israel and Iran, all of those conflicts continue. But perhaps it's fair to say that in relation to some of these conflicts, and most specifically the conflict in Ukraine and between Russia and the West, it might just be the case that we're starting to see the first cracks in the ice. I spoke yesterday about President Putin's comments about the fact that President Zelensky of Ukraine is not a viable negotiating partner for Russia in order to end the conflict in Ukraine. Putin's words have now been followed up by Leonid Slutsky, who, as well as being the leader of Russia's Liberal Democratic Party, is also the chair of the Russian Parliament's Foreign Relations Committee. And he too has followed up and said that as far as he's concerned, there's no real sign of any willingness by Ukraine to embark on negotiations. Zelensky is still there. There's no sign of any move to rescind the 2nd October 2022 decree forbidding negotiations, and here, of course, Slutsky is imitating Putin, even if Zelensky were to announce his intention to rescind the decree, since there is a question mark over Zelensky's constitutional position. It's far from certain, or far from a given, that he has any right to cancel the decree that he signed on the 2nd of October 2022. Well, that's the Russian position. I don't think we should expect it to change anytime soon. And meanwhile, the new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has been for several days now in office, and he has now began about 2 days ago, the process finally of telephoning the US's European allies, and he's finally had some discussions with them, though it should be said that it did take him some time to get that process underway. Now, there is an interesting fact, at least to me it is interesting, I'm not sure how important it is, but there is a curious detail, shall I say, about the readouts of Secretary Rubio's calls with the various European officials that he has been speaking to, which, well, it's not true of every single readout, but it is true of a surprising number of them. I'm going to give an example of what I mean, and I'm going to start with the State Department's readout of Secretary Rubio's conversation on the 27th of January with German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock. This is the readout that the State Department has published. Secretary of State Marco Rubio spoke with German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock. Secretary Rubio reaffirmed the strength and importance of the US-German relationship for transatlantic peace and prosperity. He and Foreign Minister Baerbock discussed deepening our ties across a wide range of mutual interests, including defense cooperation and stability in the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific. Now, there is an important item that one might have expected that the US Secretary of State and the German Foreign Minister would be talking about with each other, and which, by the way, I have absolutely no doubt that they did talk about with each other, but which is not mentioned in this readout. Notice that Ukraine, the words Ukraine and Russia appear nowhere in the readout. Rubio had a conversation with Baerbock. They discussed the US-German relationship and its importance in maintaining transatlantic peace and prosperity, about the need to deepen ties between Germany and the United States, and they discussed defense cooperation and stability in the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific. Certainly important matters for the United States, and to some extent, no doubt, for Germany also. But for the Germans, at least, it is the conflict with Russia, the conflict in Ukraine, that is the overriding issue of importance in foreign policy. It is the issue that Foreign Minister Baerbock has made central to her performance as Germany's foreign minister. And yet we see that the State Department has published a readout of the conversation between Rubio and Baerbock, which does not mention Russia and does not mention Ukraine, does not discuss in any way any of the relevant matters concerning the war. And it's not just Baerbock that one finds that with. There's been other conversations. So again, on the 27th of January, Secretary Rubio had a conversation with the French Foreign Minister, Jean-Noël Barrot. And this is how the State Department, again, describes the conversation. This is the readout that the State Department has provided. Secretary of State Marco Rubio spoke today with French Foreign Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs, Jean-Noël Barrot. Secretary Rubio reaffirmed the centrality of the US-France alliance to the security and prosperity of the American people. Notice that's a rather interesting phrase. Reaffirmed the centrality of the US-Franco alliance to the security and prosperity of the American people. What about the security and prosperity of the French people? Just saying. Anyway, the readout then continues. He and Foreign Minister Barrot celebrated the depth of our global cooperation and explored ways to further the US-French partnership through close collaboration and consultation on shared priorities, including defense spending. Again, notice, no reference, no mention here of Russia and Ukraine. Now, as I said, this is not true of every discussion that Rubio has had with West European leaders. He had a conversation with the British Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, which does talk about Ukraine. But again, it's perhaps worth reading the readout carefully and seeing what it says. Secretary of State Marco Rubio spoke today with UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy on a range of pressing global issues. Both leaders expressed eagerness to begin working together immediately to further our many shared foreign policy objectives. They affirmed the depth of the US-UK special relationship and the crucial nature of our partnership in addressing issues like the conflict in the Middle East, Russia's war against Ukraine, and China's malign influence. Russia's war against Ukraine, mentioned without any very strong terms. There's no Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. There's none of that value added adjectives that we used to see in readouts from the State Department in Tony Blinken's time. The conflict in Ukraine is put at the same level as the conflict in the Middle East. Notice that there is one value added adjective. Marco Rubio, known anti-China hawk. The readout refers to China's malign influence. And then again, giving us a sense of the new administration's priorities. They also heralded joint initiatives, including the AUKUS partnership, which promotes a free and open Indo-Pacific that is secure and stable. So, clearly, the priority is China's malign influence and the Indo-Pacific and Britain's role in AUKUS. The Middle East, Russia's war in Ukraine, well, these are just other issues that they also talked about. And lastly, we can go to Kaja Kallas, the EU Commissioner on Foreign Policy. Of course, she's not the Commissioner of Foreign Policy. She's the person who is focused almost, she's the overall, European foreign, let's call her the EU's foreign minister, though that's not a formal title. But anyway, we know that Kaja Kallas is almost obsessively, exclusively focused on foreign policy, on Russia policy. She talks about it incessantly and all the time. And, well, we have this readout. Secretary of State Marco Rubio spoke with EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy and Vice President of the European Commission, Kaja Kallas. Secretary Rubio underscored the need to strengthen transatlantic security, called for Europe to increase defence spending, and highlighted the challenges posed by China. The Secretary welcomed the extension of EU sanctions against Russia for its war against Ukraine. Again, no value added adjectives, no reference to aggression. He just welcomed the extension of sanctions. The Secretary and High Representative discussed ways to deepen US-EU cooperation on common principles. The priority, in other words, for Rubio is higher defence spending in Europe and meeting the challenges posed by China. As for Ukraine, well, it's good that the Europeans have decided to extend sanctions. That's it. Now, as I said, I don't know how much to read into these readouts. There's no doubt at all that Rubio and the European leaders did discuss Ukraine. And in fact, we have word that there is now a French initiative to invite Rubio to Europe on the 12th of February, where he is going to meet the Ukrainian foreign minister and the other European foreign ministers, and there's going to be a discussion, obviously, about the situation in Ukraine. But note that this is a French initiative, and there's no word so far on the State Department website that Rubio is interested in accepting this invitation, though he probably will. But anyway, we can be sure that in all of these discussions, Ukraine was discussed. But it's clear, at least to me, that the State Department under Marco Rubio in the time of Donald Trump is not giving Ukraine the overriding precedence, the priority it did in Joe Biden's and Tony Blinken's time, and that it's been relegated. The conflict in Ukraine has been relegated to a discussion of wider topics, but that the priority for Marco Rubio is China, and of course in his discussion with David Lammy, he speaks about China's malign influence. He never uses an adjective that strong with reference to Russia or to what Russia is doing in Ukraine. So anyway, we see the State Department, the Rubio State Department, apparently downplaying the significance of the conflict in Ukraine. Now, as I said, what the Europeans make of all of that is a good question. Whether this is affecting their decisions, I can't imagine that they're very pleased with all of this. These discussions have probably reinforced their overall sense that this is an administration that really wants to be rid of Ukraine and its conflict as soon as possible, because its priority is China and the contest in the Indo-Pacific, and that its heart isn't in the Ukrainian conflict to the same extent anymore. Anyway, those are the readouts that I've been reading on the State Department website. Now, in the meantime, the Trump administration preserves its silence about Ukraine. Since the flurry of interviews that Donald Trump gave over the weekend, there's been very little outward movement. But that doesn't mean that actions on the ground aren't taking place in Ukraine involving the United States. In fact, not only are events on the ground taking place, but the squeeze on Ukraine is growing, and it is creating major tensions within Ukraine itself. Now, last week, shortly after Donald Trump passed his executive order halting foreign aid to virtually all countries apart from Egypt and Israel, we got many mixed messages as to what it meant with respect to Ukraine. We first had reports which appeared, by the way, in the Ukrainian media, or at least social media space, that the executive order and a subsequent stop order from Secretary Rubio was resulting in military supplies to Ukraine being stopped. Then we got a statement from the Pentagon that this wasn't actually the case and that there'd been a misunderstanding, and that the only assistance that was being stopped was civilian aid for a 90-day period pending review, and that in the meantime, military assistance to Ukraine was continuing as normal in accordance with the previous decisions of the Biden administration and in accordance with the appropriation that Congress passed to provide aid to Ukraine, which was signed into law by President Biden in April of last year. And then gradually that story, that military aid was unaffected. That story has gradually sagged, and we had an article in Politico that contradicted it, and we've had more articles appearing in the American media since. There is a recent article in the Washington Post which says that a congressional staffer is now advising the Washington Post that military aid is indeed covered by the stop order, and it is affected as well. It's interesting that there has been no straightforward statement to this effect from the administration, and it's not at all clear exactly what is going on. Probably it is true that some military aid is continuing to arrive in Ukraine, but clearly there are interruptions of some kind, though it's impossible for the moment to get an accurate sense of how fully extensive they are. And, well, last week there were articles in the media, in the Financial Times, about how officials in the State Department were pleading for relaxation in the stop order with respect to Ukraine. They were asking for Ukraine to be exempted, aid for Ukraine to be exempted, in the same way that aid to Egypt and Israel had been exempted. It's clear that Donald Trump, the president, and his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, have not heeded those calls. And of course, we've had more reports of more suspensions from the National Security Council, from the State Department, from US aid, from all of the various agencies and departments that have been involved in providing this aid to Ukraine. And it is starting to have a very visible effect in Ukraine itself. Now, the first thing is that we've had reports over the last couple of hours that the stop-off in aid is provoking a crisis within the Western media, the Ukrainian media complex. This is an astonishing story, but there are reports now that more and more Ukrainian newspapers, including heavyweight newspapers like Ukrainska Pravda, are coming forward and admitting that without this flow of American funding, their funding is coming to a stop, and that they are heading into a kind of crisis. And we've had some remarkable admissions about this, including from people like Alexei Arestovich, Zelensky's former spin doctor. He said that almost 90% of Ukrainian media survived thanks to grants. Actually, this is called intellectual occupation. Domestic humanities and media were intercepted and put under control back in the 90s, and this is the secret of why, instead of a large multicultural symphony of Ukraine humanitarians began to dig a dugout, a Ukrainian army dugout here, the size of the largest European country. This is one of the main reasons, this is all according to Arestovich, for the start of the war, because when the Biden administration needed to buy Ukraine to contain Russia, it didn't have to try very hard. Everything had been bought long ago. Now, it is really very remarkable. It is absolutely astonishing, in fact, that it has now become clear that 90%, and I think this is the correct figure, I don't think that's exaggerated. Arestovich is saying it, but lots of other sources are saying it too. 90% of the media space in Ukraine was functioning on direct American funding. In other words, the State Department was funding the entire media operation inside Ukraine, what Ukrainians were reading in their newspapers, what Westerners were reading in the Ukrainian media. And it's important to say that many Ukrainian media outlets have English language editions. And to my knowledge, Western journalists reporting the war often go to these English language Ukrainian media outlets for a sense of what is going on in the war. Anyway, that all of these media outlets, practically without exception, were functioning on American grants. Now, of course, the argument is that these were grants, that the United States didn't interfere, or I should say perhaps more accurately, the State Department didn't interfere directly in the editorial policies of these Ukrainian media outlets. Of course, you can believe that if you wish, but if you do believe it, well, as I often say, I have a bridge to sell you. Briefly, as we have always seen, he who pays the piper calls the tune. I cannot imagine that any media outlet in Ukraine, dependent for its survival on American grants, would say anything that it thought or feared would be disapproved of in Washington. Just saying. So there we are. So the entire media space in Ukraine, provision of most of the information or much of the information that the Western media has relied on, dependent on American taxpayers, run by the State Department on the back of funding supplied by American taxpayers. And that, I suspect, is only the start of the problem. With the funding stopping, more and more agencies, more and more departments of the Ukrainian government are going to be increasingly affected by the aid stop. And this is going to spread across Ukrainian civil society. It's going to start affecting the payment of salaries. And I suspect at some point the working of much of what is left of Ukraine's economy. And it is starting to create political tensions. I discussed in my program yesterday the fact that there is currently a massive dispute underway within the Ukrainian Defense Ministry with the Ukrainian Defense Minister Rustem Umerov, now the object of corruption allegations and apparent investigations. Now, again, if you think that this is coincidence, that this is all happening coincidentally with the fact that there has been an aid stop and the fact that this aid that has stopped does apparently include some military spending as well. Well, again, if you think this is just coincidence, I have, of course, a bridge to sell you, another bridge to sell you. And that bridge is going to become very, very big and impressive if you also believe that it is mere coincidence that this crisis within the Defense Ministry, the allegations of corruption, are entirely unrelated to the fact that there are apparently rumors in Washington that the new team is now going to carry out a thorough and systematic audit of how the aid money funneled to Ukraine has been spent, with possible action taken against officials, American and perhaps Ukrainian, who might be considered to have misappropriated the money in some way. So we can see that this is indeed having an effect. We don't know what the long-term objective behind all of this is, whether it is to pressure Ukraine in some way, to force it into negotiations, or whether it is the first step towards distancing the United States from Ukraine. Since there's been no real explanation of this decision, we don't actually know the reasoning, the full reasoning behind it. And note that in all of the readouts that I read out, the ones that the State Department has provided of Secretary Rubio's conversations, there is no mention, there is no reference to the aid stop to Ukraine at all. Not even in the conversations with Kaya Kallas and David Lammy, where the war in Ukraine is at least mentioned, if only in passing. So we don't have the full idea, but I am going to make one important observation. Again, I don't have the exact figures. I don't think anybody has the exact figures, because I strongly suspect, in fact, I am absolutely sure, that over and above the congressionally mandated appropriations for Ukraine, Ukraine is almost certainly been receiving significant assistance from the United States during the period of the Biden administration, made possible through various creative accounting devices, probably roping in funds nominally assigned to other programs, probably, for example, funding allocated to the intelligence community, has been used for all sorts of activities in Ukraine. Lots of things like that have been going on. But one way or the other, I am going to guess, and I don't just think that this is a guess, in fact, I am absolutely sure that apart for the funding provided to Israel and perhaps Egypt, Ukraine has been by far the biggest recipient of US aid funding since the start of the Biden administration. More so even, for example, than Taiwan. And a lot of this, to repeat again, almost certainly funding provided that goes beyond the declared funding that has been provided by Congress. Just saying. So, this is a huge squeeze, and the Ukrainians are getting extremely nervous. There's been statements in Ukraine that this took them completely by surprise, that they hadn't expected this. This is really very interesting because, in fact, in the months leading up to the election, and even before, actually, Donald Trump had dropped many hints that as soon as he became president, he would stop funding for Ukraine. I've been aware of those hints. I think I've even discussed them in programs on this channel. So quite why this has come as such a complete bolt from the blue for the Ukrainians is a good question, actually. But anyway, they apparently were not prepared for it. They'd not made any precautions. They'd not taken any precautions in preparation of it. Perhaps they relied too much on assurances from the Biden people that the aid to Ukraine had been Trump-proofed in some kind of a way. Anyway, the Ukrainians are clearly affected. They don't know quite what to do. They are now coming to the European Union on hands and knees, and they're begging for the European Union to provide the funding in place of the United States. Now, the Europeans will probably try to some extent to do that, But every single European country is now, to a greater or lesser extent, experiencing a budgetary crisis. When I was in Hungary a few weeks ago, I attended a meeting with the Deputy Finance Minister of Hungary, and he told me about how incredibly difficult it was for Hungary to sort out its budget because of the severe constraints on spending that had happened. And of course, the problem that Hungary faces is identical to the problem that is faced to a greater or lesser extent by every European country. In France, the government is in crisis because it cannot agree a budget. In Germany, the government collapsed and we have ongoing elections because of arguments about the budget. In Britain, the British government's, the new Labour government's budget has been so ill received because it's been forced to increase taxes and borrowing that the country has probably fallen into recession. Every European country, to a certain degree, to a greater or lesser extent, is going through a budgetary crisis. So, no doubt, many of the leaders of these countries very anxious to help Ukraine, but their ability to do so is diminishing the political space to continue to provide billions of dollars month by month, year by year to Ukraine is starting to run out. Of course, there is that enormously tempting pot of money in Euroclear, the frozen Russian assets, 190 billion euros worth. And of course, there's other frozen Russian assets lying around in various places as well. But Euroclear is talking strongly against seizing those assets, and European governments must be spooked to some extent by the possibility that negotiations between the United States and Russia might get going over the next few weeks, and they must be very concerned that those negotiations might eventually lead to some kind of an agreement which could result in at least a partial lifting of sanctions. And this must be adding to concerns that if those frozen assets are touched, if they are appropriated and seized to help Ukraine, then in the event that the sanctions are lifted and the Russians come for their money, European governments will be left on the hook. So all of these problems are coming together, and I'm going to make a guess. I don't think there's going to be much more money from Europe for Ukraine over the next few weeks or months at least. And this French initiative to try to get Rubio to come to Europe, to meet with the European leaders, to meet with the Ukrainian foreign minister, I'm going to make a guess that this is a last-ditch attempt by the French to try to get the Americans to relax their funding stop. And the idea is to get the European Commission involved, to try to get the European foreign ministers involved, all of them coming together and putting pressure on Rubio. But of course, the Europeans collectively know that their leverage over the United States is little, and though even if Rubio himself is to some extent perhaps sympathetic to their demands, their real problem is not Rubio, it is Donald Trump. And it is Donald Trump who basically is the man responsible for the imposition of this stop over stop order, and he is a notoriously difficult man to win round. So anyway, we will see where all of this is going. Now, of course, this is intended in theory to last for just 90 days, and we are a week through that process. There's no word about what kind of review is really underway. However, the fact that so many people are apparently being suspended across Washington is perhaps a sign that this review is not going to have a happy outcome for Ukraine at the end of it. And there is the factor that for Donald Trump personally, at the end of that 90 days, it might be awkward politically to reverse the decision, to lift the stop order, and to allow funding for Ukraine to resume. Because Donald Trump is committed to reducing US federal spending, to bringing the budget deficit in the United States under control. He has created this new agency, DOGE. He's put Elon Musk in charge. Elon Musk is supposed to find $2 trillion of spending savings across the federal system. Some of this is going to hurt domestic constituencies. Will Donald Trump really want to engage in a massive exercise in budget cutting affecting domestic programs at one and the same time as he continues to support further funding for Ukraine? Well, things like that have happened, and I'm not saying it's impossible, but I can see the political problems. I imagine that there'll be many people on the populist wing of the Republican Party, Marjorie Taylor Greene and people like that, who will not be happy at all and who would speak out against it. And, well, to be frank, at this particular point in time, I don't see any political benefits for Donald Trump in making that decision to lift the stop order, whether at the end of the 90 days or sooner, though with an unpredictable personality like Donald Trump, one can never be sure. And of course, it's unknown what internal pressures there are on him to do that, though but they certainly exist. Of that there is no doubt. Now, I'm going to finish this discussion by saying that there is, as we know, large numbers of people being suspended or sacked across the foreign policy bureaucracy. Large number of people in the National Security Council have been suspended from their duties by the new National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz. I've not heard of anything quite on that scale in the State Department itself, but there have apparently been some suspensions and at least one important resignation. And of course, there's been suspensions at USAID and things of that kind. Now, there was a very interesting article in, of all places, the Washington Post, saying that, actually it was the New York Times, saying that the Trump administration is perfectly aware that some of the people who are being fired across the federal government might at some point decide to contest their dismissals, arguing that the way that they've been dismissed violates federal law protections that as employees of the federal government they have. And this article says that Donald Trump and his legal team believe that those federal legal protections are actually unconstitutional, that they hold to the unitary theory of the executive, which is that every official of the US government, who is of course unelected, serves at the will of the one elected official of the US government, who is of course the president. And that means that the president has the constitutional right to fire or appoint anyone he wishes at any time, and that any federal laws or other laws that supposedly would restrain him have no legal effect. Now, Donald Trump and his legal people apparently know that this is controversial, and they expect that there will be legal challenges, and they are looking forward to those legal challenges because they intend to fight them all the way to the Supreme Court, and they believe that the majority of justices on the Supreme Court also share the unitary conception of the Constitution, and that the Supreme Court will rule in the president's favour, and that it will become clear that all of the legal protections that these sacked employees have been relying upon are unconstitutional. And if that happens, of course, that would enormously extend Donald Trump's power over the federal bureaucracy. He would not be at risk, as he was over his first term, of becoming the prisoner of the bureaucracy, because he would have a legal decision from the Supreme Court that he could sack anybody and everybody within that bureaucracy, and that there was no legal defense against him doing so. So apparently, the fact that this is apparently the intention of Trump's team, and the fact that the Supreme Court is widely believed likely to decide this issue in his favour, apparently that is having a dampening effect on the bringing of cases to contest this process of suspensions and sackings and investigations that officials across the federal bureaucracy are experiencing. I'm not an expert on US constitutional law, but I remember having a discussion with Robert Barnes about the unitary theory of the Constitution. It became clear to me that he has argued cases in the Supreme Court of the United States, is an adherent of this theory, and it appears to be gaining traction. Anyway, all of this could play out in a most interesting way, but it might be a mistake to think that Donald Trump is going to be seriously influenced by internal submissions from within the deep state, from within the federal bureaucracy, the permanent state of the United States, trying to get him to reverse the stop order. On the contrary, challenging Donald Trump too strongly on the issue of it might invite dismissals, which the president might actually welcome if they result in court challenges. So, to repeat again, I am not sure that Donald Trump derives any political or other benefit from reversing the stop order, whether now or in, well, it's more like 80 days now, than he would by keeping this stop order in place. And I am not sure what the Europeans can do to mitigate the effect of it. Now, I am going to suggest that this is the real policy of the Trump administration. They've made an awful lot of talk in the last couple of weeks, both before and during the inauguration period, after the inauguration period, about bringing the war to an end, seeking a negotiated settlement of Ukraine. Donald Trump has spoken very plaintively about the terrible losses and the enormous human suffering that the war has caused. But I suspect that Donald Trump's overriding priority, and that of his team, is not so much to stop the war as to extricate the United States from the war. Going back to those readouts of Rubio's conversations published by the State Department, again, they clearly tell a story of an administration that really has limited interest in Ukraine. China and what it is doing is the priority. The Middle East is at least as important as Ukraine, arguably even more so. And there really isn't that much interest or enthusiasm in Ukraine. And there's a sense that the United States has invested too much, spent too much on this war, given far too much of its weaponry to Ukraine, and that the time has come to call a stop. And I do think that when he became president, Donald Trump perhaps thought that he could somehow short-circuit the diplomatic process, panic the Russians perhaps into beginning negotiations to end the war in a way that he could package as some kind of diplomatic victory. The Russians have refused to be panicked. They are undismayed by what Trump has said. They're repeating their positions. Putin has made that very clear in his interviews with Pavel Zarubin. Other Russian officials are speaking in the same terms. So, rather than overinvest, not just in the conflict, but in attempts to resolve the conflict, in negotiations to end the conflict, just let it wither away. Start to cut off the aid, start to distance the United States from Ukraine, talk about other things, talk about China and its malign influence, talk about the Indo-Pacific, steer David Lammy, the British Foreign Secretary, to discussion of AUKUS and all of that, the Pacific and all of that, and just quietly let Ukraine slip away. Now, as I said, I'm not sure that this is a fully thought through policy. I'm not sure that the Trump people have all got together and huddled together in a corner of a room and have agreed that this is the way forward. But I do think that Donald Trump, who is an instinctive politician, will have noticed by now how limited his actual leverage over the Russians really is. And I don't think Donald Trump likes to get drawn into protracted negotiations where he lacks leverage and where there is no good outcome for him. And I suspect that by default, he's gradually slipping into the kind of policies, the kind of approach that I have outlined in this program. Certainly, the stop order suggests it. And going back to Putin, over the course of his interviews with Zarubin, actually made a very interesting point. He said that if the United States really does want to end the war in Ukraine quickly, well, they can do that very simply. They can simply stop all military aid to Ukraine within a month or a month and a half. Ukraine's military would grind to a stop. The war would end. I've come to the view, by the way, that that is an overstatement. I think that Ukraine does have enough weapons. There's been enough deliveries of weapons to Ukraine over the last couple of months. There's probably enough military production of some kind going on in Ukraine at the present time. There'll always be some supplies from Europe. Probably the United States will anyway eke out some supplies to Ukraine also. The administration might not want it to be known that it has completely interrupted supplies of aid to Ukraine. So I think that more likely than not, it will take significantly more than a month or a month and a half. But, well, Budanov, the Ukrainian intelligence chief, is reported to have said that Ukraine has until midsummer, 6 months or so, and beyond that, dangerous outcomes start to present themselves. That's how it was reported, what it was reported that he said. I said in a recent program that in the hours after Budanov said that, all kinds of denials appeared that he had really sent it. Many of these denials seem to be unconvincing and inconsistent with each other. They didn't quite explain what had happened, but I said that if there was going to be a denial, I would expect it to come from Budanov himself. And lo and behold, the man himself appeared, unusually, because he's usually a very elusive presence. But anyway, he appeared. He was seen walking in the bright sun. A Ukrainian journalist, presumably one who's still getting paid, asked him to confirm or deny whether he really did say what he said. And Budanov instead responded with an extremely complicated joke that I wasn't able to make a huge amount of sense of myself. Perhaps the best way to explain it would be to say that Budanov was said that you shouldn't believe all of the things you hear, which, well, some people would say was a denial, but hardly a straight denial. Anyway, the performance was so unconvincing that I couldn't help but think, after watching Budanov and seeing what he had to say, that he really did make the comment that Ukraine has 6 months left and probably no more than that. Now, there is, and I have to say this, an alternative view that the stop order is really the Trump administration imposing pressure on Ukraine to get the new mobilization decree, bringing the conscription age down to 18 past. As I've said, the Trump administration has not really provided much explanation for it, so you can come up with alternative reasons. I don't myself believe this. And the reason I don't believe this is because, in my opinion, the Zelensky government already took the decision some weeks ago to bring down the conscription age to 18. And they communicated the fact to the Biden White House. And I'm sure that they've also communicated the fact to the Trump people as well. The Trump team did not need to impose the stop order to achieve this. So I discount that as the reason. I think, as I said, it is more likely that the administration is gradually moving towards distancing the United States from the debacle, the coming debacle in Ukraine. And I don't think there is anything more to it than that. Now, of course, I do understand that there is also the view that the deep state in the United States, the oligarchy in the United States, continues to remain deeply committed to the project of weakening Russia and defeating Russia and doing all those sort of things, and that they will ultimately bend Donald Trump to their will. And I don't discuss the existence of these people or of their power. But all I would say is that it's not unheard of for the United States to cut its losses and to walk away from a war that it is losing. After all, that's what it basically did in Vietnam and in Afghanistan. So this would not be a new thing. It's not that the people who are running things in Washington are doves, that they've committed themselves to a program of peace. Maybe Donald Trump himself, to some extent, thinks somewhat in that way. But I doubt that this is true of most of the people who work in his administration. It's just that they see that the war is not turning out well, that it is a losing proposition for the United States, and they want to pull out whilst the US is still ahead. They would prefer, in other words, to cut their losses now and accept the embarrassment of whatever defeat comes, which they can probably manage to spin away, rather than invite the even bigger defeat when the Russians still win. That would happen if the United States persisted in the Biden-era policies, which, to be clear, could only delay the inevitable Russian victory, not prevent it. It's, as I said, a purely cold-blooded, pragmatic calculation, and that is all there is to it. There's no great sentiment here. There's no feelings of any great warmth or change of attitude to the Russians. It's simply that the battlefield and military and logistical and geopolitical realities point the United States towards a change of direction and a change of course. Now, that brings me to two very, very fascinating articles that have appeared over the last 24 hours. One is in Responsible Statecraft, the website of the Quincy Institute, one of the finest analytical places that you can find. I mean, it is an absolutely outstanding website in almost all respects. Doesn't mean, by the way, that I agree with everything that is written there. But in terms of the quality of analysis, well, it's pretty much as good as you will find in any publication that you could argue has a kind of mainstream character in the United States. Anyway, this article, which appeared yesterday, is by Steve Jermy, who is British and is, in fact, apparently a Commodore was a Commodore in Britain's Royal Navy. To give his bio at the end of the program. He's a former Royal Navy Commodore. He commanded warships in the 5th Destroyer Squadron and Britain's Fleet Air Arm. He served in the Falklands War and in the Adriatic for the Bosnian and Kosovo campaigns, and retired after an operational tour in 2007 as strategy director in the British Embassy in Afghanistan. So this is a very experienced British military and naval officer. And I have to say, reading this article is a relief, because it shows that powers of analysis and reality do still exist within the military leadership in Britain. And Commodore Jeremy's discussion is about the real balance of military power in the West. And he talks about the weaknesses of NATO. He points out that despite claims that NATO is the strongest, most powerful military alliance in history, nonetheless, NATO was recently defeated in Afghanistan by the Taliban. So how can one argue that it is indeed the strongest military alliance that has ever existed? Well, that's true. But then he looks at the more practical realities, the more immediate realities, and he looks at the Russia-NATO balance in Europe. And he makes the point that unlike Russia, no major NATO nation is industrially mobilized for war, as evidenced by the fact that Russia is still outproducing NATO on 155mm shells for Ukraine. And he then says the unmentionable. He says that it is not clear that NATO could mobilize at the speed or scale needed to produce the levels of equipment, ammunition, and people to match Russia. And certainly not without a long build-up that would signal our intent. This is not just about lost industrial capacity, but also financial capacity. Of the largest NATO nations, only Germany has a debt to GDP ratio below 100%. And he then points out that if we were into the nightmare scenario of a NATO-Russia war, US forces would need to deploy at scale into continental Europe, that the US Army currently has a 2023 establishment of 473,000 men, which is only a third of the size of the current Russian army, that transferring all these men across the Atlantic to Europe would run the gauntlet of Russian submarine-launched torpedoes and mines and all of the other naval weapons that the Russians could deploy. He points out that the Oreshnik, which has recently been demonstrated by the Russians, would enable the Russians to levy massive damage to NATO's logistic capabilities and its supplies. And he also discusses the many, many other problems that NATO suffers. It's the degree to which it is fragmented, its lack of a proper war-fighting strategies, its many, many problems in any contest against the Russians. And he ends that the truth is that NATO now exists to confront the threats created by its continued existence. Yet, as our scenario shows, NATO does not have the capacity to defeat the primary threat that its continuing existence has created. This is the time to have an honest conversation about the future of NATO and to ask two questions. How do we return to the sustainable peace in Europe that all sides to the conflict seek? Notice he uses the word all sides, so he includes the Russians here. And is NATO the primary obstacle to this sustainable peace? In other words, Commodore Jeremy is suggesting that NATO is providing the West, the United States and the Europeans with the worst possible outcome. It is destabilizing security in Europe. It is provoking the Russians and making them into a threat without having the capacity to defeat them in war. In fact, he clearly believes that NATO might end up losing a conventional Russia-NATO war, facing Western leaders with the choice, the potential choice, between total capitulation and a nuclear apocalypse. So he says, let's take a step back and think this through. Let's ask ourselves whether this confrontation with Russia actually makes any kind of sense for us. Let's see whether instead we can come to some understanding with the Russians, because since we can't defeat them, realistically, that is the only rational choice we have. Well, that was Commodore Jeremy, and I thought a very interesting article on responsible statecraft. Now, it has been, if anything, surpassed in quality by another article which has been written on a Substack blog that goes by the title Institutional War Theory. And I should say that I am not familiar with the writer of this article. I know nothing about this person's background. The person does not attach his or her name to the article, but it is an article that is so well researched. It is so strongly based also on academic material. It gives information that the author of the article has been in contact with various people, with journalists, with academics, with people of that kind, that whoever the author of this article is, one can see that they are extremely well versed and very full of understanding about the entire situation in terms of the military balance in Europe. And this article reads, the Russian military, the title of it is, the Russian military is now stronger than the US and NATO. And it goes on to say, the subtitle says, republication in response to Steve Jeremy's article, right now NATO could not win a war against Russia. Well, what the article does, this article does, is it takes some of the main points that Commodore Jeremy has been making, and it looks at the whole story of the war. It looks at the development of the Russian military industrial complex. It looks at the evolution of the Russian military during the war. It looks at its command structures, its tactics, its strategies, its ability to innovate on the battlefield, its development of combat tactics, which have evolved continuously through the war. It looks at the way in which the military is absorbing technologies and developing new technologies. And it comes to what I think is an irrefutable conclusion, which is that at some point during this war, the strategic military balance between Russia and the West, and I want to stress I'm now talking specifically about the military balance, total balance of aggregate power is not just a military balance, but specifically this article looks at the military balance, and it comes to the conclusion that, well, I'll read what the article says. My assessment is that February 2024 was the turning point when Russia's military became more powerful than NATO. This was when Russia won the Battle of Avdiivka and decisively defeated the Zaporozhye offensive. Seeing these two events back to back indicated a big change in Russian defense capabilities since their retreats of 2022 and heavy losses in the Battle of Bakhmut. Instead of seeing more blunders, we witnessed Russia defeat the first blitzkrieg offensive since 1941 and capture Ukraine's most heavily fortified choke point in Donbass within 2 months of each other. These victories paved the way for Russia's now ongoing territorial captures, demonstrating tactical dominance and strategic foresight. And this article is packed with information. It discusses growth of militaries, of armoured vehicles, of production totals, of all of those sort of things. It goes into them with a detail and a thoroughness that I think is almost unequaled. And it shows the trend rates. It shows that how with every passing month, the strategic balance in Europe, and perhaps one should make it clear that one is talking ultimately about the military balance in Europe, or at least Western Eurasia, has been passing more and more steadily in Russia's favour. Now, this article, by the way, is not a eulogy of the Russians. It makes criticisms of them. It points out their weaknesses. It discusses their mistakes. It mentions various shortfalls that they have. It acknowledges that Russia, for example, is not in a position to extend power, to project power globally in the way in which the West still can. But in terms of a West-Russia conflict, it should make extremely depressing reading for any Western theoretician or strategic analyst. Because, frankly, as I said, I don't think this article, the points that it makes, are refutable. Now, the fact that we are seeing a steady shift in the military balance, and one that is not going to be reversed anytime soon, one of the points the article makes is that the extent to which the Russian military has now become battle-hardened, the experience it has gained fighting in the war against an adversary, a near-peer adversary, equipped, trained, mobilized, and to a great extent commanded, if you like, by the West, that level of knowledge, that enormous skill set, that understanding of modern war is not one that any Western military can hope to achieve anytime soon, and that already gives Russia an inherent advantage over and above the raw facts of industrial capacity, military technology, all of these things into which this article goes into in very, very great detail. So this fact, the fact that we're talking about a fundamental shift in the strategic balance in Europe, ought in itself to persuade us to do that which Commodore Gemry is suggesting, which is to really revisit the whole question of our long-term military confrontation with the Russians. Not only are we in a very dangerous situation already with respect to them, but the balance of military advantage, far from being in our favour, is in fact in theirs, and is moving further in their favour with every passing month. So, for that reason alone, I would have thought reaching some kind of understanding with the Russians about stability and security in Europe is an overriding priority. By the way, just to quickly say, and I don't think the article says exactly this, but based on what it says, my own assessment, and this is also taken to some extent from the Gemry article, is that the military balance in Europe is now more favourable to the Russians than it was at any point in the Cold War. That the Soviet Union may have been a bigger country, its armed forces might have been larger, but it never possessed the kind of decisive advantages over the Western militaries that this article outlines. I think this is, I want to make it clear that is my own perspective rather than the perspective that the author of this article has, though maybe, for all I know, he would agree with it. So, far from negotiating with the Russians from a position of strength, we would be negotiating on military strategic questions from a position of weakness if we approached the whole issue of negotiations in a zero-sum way. Fortunately, as the article correctly points out, even though the Russians are becoming militarily more powerful every day, a fact of which, by the way, they are undoubtedly aware, they show no inclination at all to use that power aggressively in a way that seriously threatens us. So it makes sense, therefore, to try to seek an accommodation with them. We don't have to capitulate to them. We're not in that kind of dangerous position. But if we go on escalating in Ukraine, if we go on prolonging the war there, if we continue to look for ways to goad and provoke and infuriate and annoy them, well, we are arguably setting ourselves up for an even bigger geostrategic disaster than the one which we are already facing. Now, I would like to think that the people in the Trump team will read this article and the Gemry article and will draw their own conclusions and will understand that some kind of understanding with the Russians, an attempt to stabilize the situation in Europe, even to contemplate the creation of new security architecture in Europe, is in the West's interests. In the meantime, and bringing us back to the topic of Ukraine, as I've been arguing for months now, the sooner we recognize the reality that the war is lost and that the Russians have won, the better for us it will be, the better for the Ukrainians also. Now, I've left little time to discuss the military situation in Ukraine today, but there's been actually quite a lot of news. After a brief pause, after the fall of Velika Novosilka, the Russian army is back in movement. And it's now become clear that the Ukrainian forces that had previously been defending Kurakovo, after the fall of Kurakovo, retreated to a belt of villages, Dachnia being one, and the other villages, Andreevka, Orakli, Konstantinopol, was another. In fact, Redovka has provided a list of the Ukrainian brigades that are now located in these villages, and a whole cluster of brigades, all very familiar to me: the 79th Brigade, the 74th Brigade. Their remnants have all become concentrated in this small cluster of villages south of Kurakovo. Now, following the fall of Velikaya Novosilka, the Russians have now renewed their offensive towards these villages. They're in the process now, definitely, of storming Dachnia. There are pictures appearing of Russian troops there. And it looks as if the Russians are preparing to surround the Ukrainian troops in this last remaining fortified cluster of villages east of the Dnieper River. So there's been reports of significant Russian advances here over the last 24 hours. Closer to Pokrovsk, the Russians seem to be in the process of capturing the village of Udachny on the same railway lines as Kotlevo, but somewhat to the south. And it looks as if they're now starting to press north from Kotlevo as well. The Russian commentator, Kimakovsky, who's also, by the way, a advisor to Denis Pushilin, he's actually said that there is now good reason to think that Ukrainian forces in the area of Pokrovsk are soon going to be surrounded as well. He says the enemy is trying to put up resistance north of Selidovo and close to Pokrovsk, and is even deploying brigades of the 150th series. That is to say, reserve brigades. For what purpose? For the purpose of holding back our advance west to the Dnieper border, the Dnieper region, to prevent our forces from enveloping Pokrovsk in the west and the north, because our troops are already encircling from the side of Mirnograd, in other words, from the area of Ozvizhenka, where, as I've discussed previously, they've already cut the main road. Therefore, the enemy may be trapped in yet another fire pocket there, and it will have either to withdraw from there or suffer the same fate as in Velikaya Novosilka, except, of course, that the disaster will be much greater still. And if we go further west, in the area of Siversk, there's now again fighting in Verkhokamyanska, village immediately to the east of Siversk. The Russians claim to have captured it some weeks ago. Some people doubted that. Then the Ukrainians definitely re-established control. Now it looks as if the Russians are back, and fighting for this village is starting all over again, or so it seems. And in Chasiv Yar, it looks as if the Russians have been very busy over the last couple of hours, and here it seems also they're close to breaking through. And from what I can tell, the various Ukrainian counterattacks in Toretsk seem to be coming to nothing and are achieving no substantive results. So the Russians are back on the advance, and they continue to launch missile and drone strikes across Ukraine, even as the Ukrainians try their own drone strikes against Russia. And I have already suggested that those drone strikes that the Ukrainians are launching are basically demonstration attacks, more intended to maintain support in the West, unable fundamentally to change the direction of the war or the trajectory of the Russian economy's continued growth. So, peace in Ukraine is now an imperative. I'm not sure how it will be achieved. I'm increasingly coming round to the view, as I discussed in this program, that the Trump administration, sensing that perhaps a negotiated outcome is impossible, is now coming quietly round to the view that it's going to wash its hands of the whole affair and downplay its significance. Well, that might work to a certain degree in terms of handling the media impact of defeat in Ukraine. But it is not enough, given the fact that the balance of military power in Europe is shifting decisively in the Russians' favour to an extent that I think has never been true before. The time has come to try to negotiate with them in earnest for once and to try to achieve a long-term sustainable peace in Europe. Well, that's my program for today. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.